not accelerated up to the Department of Health, should it have been? HES say that they have been reporting their issue with incineration to regulators for quite a long time, and yet the Minister says there is no issue of capacity. So could a response not have been to direct HES to all of this other extra capacity that is apparently existing within incineration? And as we have more local authorities going to zero waste and incinerating material that would have been in landfill, that pressure will increase. So there's probably ageing infrastructure, there's probably a need to expand. So does the government plan a waste incineration strategy going forward?
Well, I thank the Honourable Lady for that question, and she's absolutely right that the company HES has, I think it's 4 sites in Scotland, and the Scottish Environment Protection Agency has been conducting regular site inspections in respect to those, and we are looking very closely at that, not least in terms of the movement of waste from one site to another. But she's correct that no issues specifically I'm aware of in terms of those. In terms of the enforcement notice, the primary purpose of those notices has been to encourage the company back into compliance, and that is the focus that the Environment Agency has had. The reason for the partial suspension in terms of Normanton has been the unwillingness of the company to respond to that, but very much the focus has been through those enforcement notices to encourage the company back into compliance. And some of those notices are for what might be seen as relatively minor issues such as documentation, but obviously some of it relates to the overstorage on those sites. Notices are for what might be seen as relatively minor issues such as documentation.
I'm pleased that new contracts have been signed and enforcement action taken, and quickly. But what's really important is lessons learned from this. So could the Minister expand on that? And whilst this is a very sensitive matter, understandably is evoking all kinds of concern amongst the public, could the Minister give us assurances that there has been no risk to any patients at any time, or indeed to the wider public, over this most concerning of issues?
I'm grateful for my honourable friend for that question, and I'm very happy to give her constituents that assurance that there has been no risk to patients at any point during this time. In terms of the lessons learned, then clearly we will need to look at some of the lessons, particularly in terms of what triggers a breach of contract. This was a series of contracts held by a wide number of trusts with the supplier, and it's important that we look at what the notification periods are, what the monitoring, what the enforcement processes are, and what powers there were within the terms of the contract in order to ensure that the company is acting as it should.
Yvette Cooper.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I say to the Minister, we still don't have the basic facts about what medical waste is being held at the Normanton site, how far over the environmental limits it currently is, and what the timetable is for compliance. And perhaps he could share that information with us. And does he not accept that it is a basic principle of dealing with any kind of public health and environmental health risk or incident that you provide proper, full, factual information to the public, to the community, at the earliest possible opportunity? You don't hide behind contractual negotiations, and would he accept there is nothing in the contract negotiations that would have prevented him or the Health Secretary providing some basic facts about those risks much, much earlier than today?
So in terms of the split to which the Honourable Lady refers between the clinical waste element and other waste in terms of the Normanton site, which quite rightly she focuses on in terms of her own constituents. In terms of the flow, just under a third of the flow of waste to that site is clinical. Just over 2/3, my understanding, is non-clinical. So it's not that all the waste on the Normanton site will be clinical waste. And as I referred to within the term clinical waste, some of the media reports of what that constitutes is slightly different to what the reality is also. In terms of the notification, I set that out both in my written ministerial statement and in my comments today. The key focus has been to maintain the continuity of operations and service within the NHS Trust, so that we are not in a position where clinical waste cannot be cleared from those trusts. That is what the focus, and that's why during those commercial negotiations and the contingency being put in place, that's why we've come today to the House and not at an earlier point.
Yeah. He's fixed it. Mr. Philip Hollowbone.
In the end, the system has worked. There's been no backup of clinical waste in hospitals. It's just been stored or overstored in these sites. But it is worrying if it's true that 13 warning notices were issued and 2 compliance notices to this company. And does the Minister feel that he should be alerted earlier by the Environment Agency should this sort of thing happen in the future?
Honourable friend raises a very valid point, which is what are the lessons to learn from this? And clearly, in terms of when the NHS was first made aware of this, what powers there are to enforce at an earlier stage are part of what I would expect us to be looking at in terms of moving forward. But as I referred to earlier, the enforcement notices cover a spectrum of risk. Some of those are more technical in nature than others, and so whilst there have been 13 notices, they do cover a range of severity in terms of their enforcement.
Their last accounts, HES made a gross profit of over £15 million last year. Oh. What financial penalty will they suffer because of their gross incompetence?
Well, I mean, the first financial penalty they will have suffered is the prompt action we have taken this weekend, Mr. Speaker, in the form of 15 NHS trusts cancelling those contracts and moving across. So there is a clear financial penalty in terms of their loss of business. In terms of the fines, then obviously that will be for the legal process through the Environment Agency in the normal way. That isn't an NHS matter. The focus within the NHS has been on maintaining continuity of service.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Minister will be aware that my constituents in Redditch will just want to be assured that their operations in Redditch and in Worcester will be able to continue as normal. Can you give them that assurance?
Yes, yes I can, Mr. Speaker.
Mary Cray.
Speaker, the government likes to talk tough on waste criminals, but here we have waste criminals storing 350 tonnes of clinical waste illegally, 5 times the amount of compliance at their site in Normanton. And despite him being told about this on the 31st of July, neither the MP nor local constituents were informed. Cobra was informed. Criminal charges are now underway at the company. Can he make sure that not a single acute hospital trust loses 1 penny piece as a result of their criminal negligence?
Well, the Honourable Lady raises several points there. Firstly, in terms of the 350 tonnes of clinical waste, I clarified in my comments to the member for Normanton as to the flow and how not all that waste is clinical. I wasn't personally told on the 31st of July. I set out in my written ministerial statement when the NHS and then when ministers were told. In terms of her point as to whether there is any cost to NHS trusts, which I think is a very valid one for all constituency MPs who wish to understand the situation there, the contingency cost, for example, from the additional capacity being put into place at trusts will be borne centrally by the NHS family. In terms of the processing of clinical waste, that will be borne by NHS trusts just as it has been to date.
Mr. Kevin Foster.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I welcome the action the Minister has taken to terminate the contracts with this company, given their clear breaches and failures to deliver what they said they would. I noticed in his statement he referred to the capacity for clinical waste incineration. Could he perhaps give some further details about how he's satisfied himself that there is capacity in each region? As clearly these are specialist facilities, and the impact of having to transport waste would potentially have a knock-on effect.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Just on a point of clarification, I just should clarify it's not me personally that's terminated these contracts. These are contracts held by the trusts themselves with HES, and therefore it's a decision taken by those trusts. In terms of capacity, there is, as I referred to in my earlier remarks, there is significant additional capacity within the incinerator landscape to process the waste that would be generated by this contract. And therefore, the suggestion, which has been reported in some quarters, that this is an issue of a lack of capacity is simply not valid. To be clear, HS produces 595 tonnes a month that goes to incineration, and the NHS identified 2,269 tonnes of incineration capacity. So reports that this is a lack of capacity in the market are not valid.
We're Streeting.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I learned from the Health Service Journal that Barking, Havering and Redbridge University Trust was one of those affected, and I think it's totally unacceptable that clearly one of the objectives of ministers was to cover things up for as long as possible to save their own blushes because of the failure of a government contractor. And I don't think members of this House should learn of such events from the media. We should hear it from ministers via the dispatch box or the relevant select committee, or, you know, there is such a thing as email. Putting that to one side, ministers have announced that £1 million worth of contingency funding is to be made available to support trusts affected. Will this be met from existing departmental budgets? Will the money be allocated additionally by the Treasury? And surely, further to the point made by my honourable friend, the member for Leicester West, it should be the failing contractor that coughs up £1 million, if not more. It shouldn't be coming from taxpayers.
Yeah.
Well, we all learn things on a regular basis from the HSJ, but I think to suggest that he should have been told about this when we were ensuring continuity of service, when we were putting in place the alternative arrangements to ensure that operations could continue at Barking and other hospitals, seems misplaced, and it's a point I've already addressed. In terms of the cost, again, I referred to that earlier, that some of the costs, this contingency cost, will be absorbed centrally. Others, which are the normal costs of clearing clinical waste, were borne by the Trust before. They will continue to be borne by the Trust, as was earlier the case.
To Caroline Johnson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd first like to welcome the fact that there has been no gap in service provision, no public health risk, and that the Minister has confirmed that nobody has had an operation delayed because of this build-up of clinical waste. But it is still concerning that this contract was not properly delivered. Can I ask the Minister how long he has given this site to return to compliance and what action he's taking to supervise the remaining contracts?
Well, in terms of the performance under the contracts, the key issue is what contractually are the legal requirements on HES and whether those contractual terms have been breached. And part of the lessons learned is to look at whether those contractual enforcement powers are sufficient. In terms of moving forward in respect to the other HES sites, then again it will firstly depend on the contracts that the supplier has and whether they're in breach of those or in breach of enforcement action from the Environment Agency. So to date, the Environment Agency has served one partial suspension in terms of Normanton site. As I referred to, the Environment Agency were at the other sites over the weekend. This is an area of significant scrutiny, but it will be for a matter for the Environment Agency to determine whether they are not in compliance with their permits.
Maria Eagle.
Speaker, so far the Minister appears to have been far more interested in contractual arrangements than in public accountability. Can he explain how come Cobra has met and this House has not been informed about it? This House should be informed about Cobra meetings as soon as possible after they're finished. No.
Well, I'm not sure, Mr. Speaker, on the exact protocols around when Cobra should and should not be reported, but given that it usually deals with highly confidential matters, I would have thought the first instance isn't necessarily to report every issue. In respect to Cobra, what we have been focused on is not contractual nicety. It has been ensuring that the NHS continues to operate the first-class service that it can, that it continues to deliver the services, and that is what our focus has been on. I referred to earlier as to the fact that this is the first opportunity we've had following the conference recess to notify the House following the contractual arrangements being made.
Tom Bursglove.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Could my honourable friend confirm that the backlog of waste will be dealt with speedily and in accordance with the requirements of the law and with appropriate supervision?
Well, I very much share my honourable friend's desire for the backlog to be cleared as speedily as possible. As I referred to a moment ago, this is an area of scrutiny for the Environment Agency, and it is important that the company complies with its legal requirements and ensures that the level of waste is in line with its permits as soon as possible.
Nick Dakin.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Hospitals like Scunthorpe General cannot run effectively without the safe and secure disposal of clinical waste. Exactly, and that's exactly why it's important that the Minister's made the comments he's made today. But can he be very clear? NLAG put quite properly local contingencies in place because obviously they couldn't rely on things being sorted. It now looks as if contingencies are sorted nationally. But can he be very clear that there will be no extra cost, not a penny more of extra cost to local trusts as a result of this?
So the honourable gentleman raises a very fair point, and so I want to be very sort of clear in terms of the distinction. So in terms of additional cost from the contingency arrangement, so for example putting in place extra storage on the trust sites, then that won't be an additional cost to the trust, and I think he'll be reassured by that. What I don't want to do is give the suggestion to him that there won't be any impact financially on trusts, because they have the requirement to clear clinical waste sits with the trust. That is why contractually the trust themselves had contracts with the supplier. The ongoing arrangements of that are likely to have some increased cost as the new supplier comes on board, and that will fall to the trust, but not the contingency element of it.
Thank you. Order. Urgent question. Kate Osamore.
Oops. To ask the Secretary of State for International Development to make a statement on her plans to use private investments to make up part of the government's commitment to spend 0.7% of GNI on overseas development aid.
Secretary of State for International Development, Secretary Penny Mordaunt.
Mr. Speaker, combined global investment flows into developing nations is currently $1.4 trillion. Leaving a funding gap of over $2.5 trillion to deliver the global goals. We have 12 years left on those goals. We are currently 80 years adrift on nutrition, 100 years adrift on education, and 200 years adrift on ending extreme poverty. If we want to deliver the global goals, we have to let others help, including the private sector. And we also know that we have had good returns from our investments in developing nations. CDC manages an average annual return in sterling of 7%. So investing in developing nations could offer investors a greater return for their savings or pension holders. We've £8 trillion under investment in the City of London. If 1% of that were redirected to Africa, it would lever $110 billion. Compare that to the total aid spend currently going into Africa of $50 billion. I believe the public would be interested in their savings and their pension funds helping this agenda to deliver the global goals. Imagine an app that you could access and you could select which particular goals you wanted your savings and your pension fund to help. We have the tools to do this. At UNGA, a couple of weeks ago, we unveiled the World Benchmarking Alliance, which will grade companies' performance against the global goals. And we have the expertise to do this in the City of London, in DFID, and our partners, and also through our world-beating impact investment organisations. And so we want to explore doing this. And today I have announced a national conversation with financial institutions, with savers, with pensioners, and with the wider public. And the results of that we will announce at a UK-Africa investment conference next year. This is the only way we will deliver the global goals. And over the past 2 years, we have worked with our partners to also shift the dial on international aid rules, allowing our aid budget to help the private sector invest in sustainable development more than ever before. And I will continue to work with our partners at the Organisation for Economic Cooperation and Development to make sure that the aid rules incentivise donors to lever in private sector investment where it is needed. In future years, as the amount of funding coming back into our own development financial instruments, so this is publicly owned financial instruments, as that amount of funding increases, we should be open to using these profits to count towards the 0.7%. And I'm exploring the scope to reinvest those funds with the DAC committee to maximise the value of our investments. We remain committed to 0.7%. It was this government that introduced it. But as we do so, we should ensure that the British public get a triple return on their generosity and compassion, a stronger personal return to them, a stronger Britain, and a more prosperous and secure world.
Kate Osamore.
I thank the Speaker for granting this question, and I thank the Minister for being here. Mr. Speaker, the country's commitment to spend 0.7% of our national income on overseas aid is a clear expression of how deeply the UK public care about eradicating poverty overseas. The public are therefore right to be feeling betrayed by the Minister's speech today, in which she has suggested that global poverty can be utilised as a lucrative investment opportunity. It is deeply concerning to learn of her plans to redefine aid through today's media reports. As the rules which govern aid spending are set at an international level by OECD, can the Minister tell us what precise rules she wants to change? And Mr. Speaker, in the absence of any details, we are only left to speculate as to how the Secretary of State believes these new investments will help the world's poorest. Her claim that private investment is a win-win is not based on evidence. We all know that there are both winners and losers from foreign investment in the global south. Her vision will leave the most vulnerable people at the mercy of global markets. Does the Minister recognise that her approach will mean that major development issues that are not considered profitable will no longer get the funding they need? And the press has reported that this private investment will replace public contributions to UK aid budget. Could the Minister confirm if this is indeed her plan? I think the public deserve to know.
Yeah. Well, I gave a lengthy speech, Mr. Speaker, this morning, and there is plenty of detail in there about, well, it's online, the Honourable Lady can read it. Let me be very clear about the rule changes that we would explore. Currently, when we capitalise an investment instrument, we count that capitalisation as ODA. When we make the investment, we do not. And we're very happy with that. We have argued for it. That is what happens now. But in future years, once we've capitalised those instruments, we may wish to change the way we do this. It's not double counting. It's allowing the returns that we make on these investments to be used more flexibly. The issue at the moment is, and we're very happy, it suits us at the moment to do this, but the issue is, if we then reinvest those funds in development, they don't count towards the 0.7. If we take them out to spend it on the NHS or a domestic priority, it counts negatively. So what we are arguing for is exploring at this stage, changing those rules to allow us to do that. In addition to that, we have got to accept that even with the combined total of our budget, but also other nations, we are not going to deliver the global goals unless we let the private sector do more. And currently, I think those £8 trillion in the city could be put to better use. They may actually deliver higher returns for those pension funds, and they will also do a huge amount of good in the developing world. And the Honourable Lady's asked me, the Right Honourable Lady's asked me for some examples. So CDC, which I understand the Honourable Lady wishes to abolish, the oldest financial institution in the world, last year made investments of over £1 billion. That created 735,000 jobs. We need to create 18 million jobs every year until 2035 just to keep up with, this is what we have to do to keep up with the population growth in Africa, and that is what we need to do to eradicate extreme poverty. If the Honourable Lady has a better suggestion of how we manage to raise $2.5 trillion, I would be very interested to hear it. But I am here not to make us feel good about spending aid money. I'm here to eradicate extreme poverty. And we cannot do that without business, and we cannot do that without the private sector. And dogma has no place in this debate.
Sir Desmond Swain.
So if we are to avoid a growing army of underemployed, desperate and angry young people, we need 600 million new jobs over the next decade. Does she imagine that that can be provided without an enormous mobilisation of private sector investment in the developing world?
Well, the right honourable gentleman is right. And we are entering into the final decade, the last push towards the global goals. And we have got to be realistic. If we are going to achieve them, and I want to achieve them, we have to let other people help.
Patrick Grady.
Mr. Speaker, I think it's a bit disappointing that this has had to be an urgent question and not a statement, and it's being made while the Select Committee is travelling, which is why I'm standing here and not my honourable friend from Dundee West. And it's also disappointing in terms of the impact of this announcement, because there has been for many years, despite everything else going on, cross-party consensus and huge public support for the delivery of the 0.7% target through public funds. The UK is supposed to be world leading in this, and this kind of backpedalling and backsliding and finding different ways of leveraging the 0.7% actually risks undermining global leadership, which I thought was supposed to be a government priority in the face of Brexit. Does she accept that the global goals, meeting the global goals, are in our interest to build a safer, more sustainable and more secure world? They're not things that happen elsewhere in poor countries overseas. It's for everybody's benefit. Why not be more ambitious and use this money to go beyond the 0.7% target, which is what the SNP proposed in our white paper on independence? Can she commit that she is actually committed to retaining that target in one shape or form? They're already double counting money that's spent to defence, and this is simply more of the same. If there's going to be an app that lets us choose how money is spent, when can I go onto that app and choose that my tax money is not spent on Trident and is spent on aid instead?
Well, I thank the honourable gentleman for those questions. I think he's a little confused about what the 0.7% is. It's not possible to count private investment towards that figure. So a pension fund down the road can't count towards 0.7%. But public funds can, and that's what I mean, the DAC committee measures many things, and including private sector investment, but the 0.7% is public money. So actually, what we could do, if a future government wished to, is spend more than 0.7%. We're committed to spend at least that amount of money, but it could do so by counting the returns that it makes. At the moment, we are spending more than 0.7% because we cannot do anything other than that with those funds, and they don't count towards that 0.7%. And I think that we need to get the balance between our commitments on this agenda, which are world leading, and we introduce them and we believe in them, and the demands that we are making on the British taxpayer. And if in future years we can meet 0.7% without having to ask the British taxpayer for more money, well, that is an option we should explore.
Sir David Evanet.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As the UK leaves the EU, would my right honourable friend agree that it remains in our national interest to continue to tackle these global challenges, including migration, humanitarian crises, peace work and security, but also we need to maximise the effectiveness of our overseas aid?
Yeah.
Well, the honourable gentleman is right, and we do have the opportunity of looking in future years at what we might do with the 1.5 billion that we currently channel into the EU. I have set out very clearly that we would like to continue working with our European partners. If done through the EU, we would have to ensure that they were not discriminating against British NGOs, and I have outlined in the past at a select committee, but also in my speech today, how we would protect British NGOs and their beneficiaries in such circumstances.
Luciana Berger.
Speaker, does the Secretary of State stand by the unnamed briefing to newspapers today, which has been done on her behalf, which stated, when investors step in, the taxpayer can step back?
That's what this is
And
about.
does she think there is any other interpretation of such a statement than she intends to resile from this country's honourable commitment to spend 0.7% on development?
I can say to the honourable lady that I and my staff, both my political staff and also my DFID staff, have not briefed that. But I can tell you that if we can actually lift people out of poverty, which we need the private sector to do. They are the ones that can create jobs. They are the ones that can actually close that enormous funding gap we have on the global goals. Then yes, we will, in future years, I hope, be able to spend less money on these things because there will not be the need. But that lies many years ahead. There will always be a need for humanitarian aid, but we have made huge progress over the last few decades in lifting people out of poverty, and I want us to finish the job in Africa.
Luke Graham.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I welcome some of the comments from the Secretary of State and her commitment to the 0.7% target. Can she reassure the House that it remains a mission of this House and this government to tackle the global challenges of climate change, humanitarian crises and economic development?
I absolutely do, and that is why I'm saying to the House, to the City, and to our fellow donor nations that we have to start levering in others to help us with this agenda. If we really want to deliver the global goals, then, and we've been talking about the billions to trillions agenda for a very long time, we actually need to start delivering on it. And today I've set out how we will start to do that.
And Janet Davey.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. What steps is the Secretary of State taking to allow Parliament to properly scrutinise private investments in developing countries to ensure that they have a positive development impact on poorer countries?
Well, I hope that the Honourable Lady will welcome the announcement at the UN General Assembly, which I reiterated in my speech today, because for the first time we have a tool where we can see how companies are graded against the delivery of the global goals. What is it they are doing socially, environmentally, to ensure that the global goals are met? That benchmarking alliance was unveiled at UNGA. I think it will be a huge tool, not just for parliaments and investors, but also the public as well, who I think care very much about how their savings and pensions are invested.
Nick Herbert.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My right honourable friend is surely right to focus on the need to increase private sector investment in developing countries, because in the end, however big the aid budget is, it will be dwarfed by private sector trade and investment flows, which are essential. Exactly. But does she also agree that aid is particularly important where private sector investment fails, for instance, in the development of new drugs which are essential to beat diseases like tuberculosis?
I absolutely agree. And actually, the more we can help others lean in and help with job creation, the more we can do on those other areas, which only we can do on health and humanitarian in particular.
Tom Brake.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm not sure whether it was the Secretary of State's intention, but most of the press coverage about her speech this morning seemed to be suggesting this was a leadership bid. But on the subject of CDC, which, as I understand it, lost £73 million last year, can the Secretary of State confirm that she understands the concerns around CDC's investment in things like shopping centres, which may not actually deliver the best bang for your buck in terms of aid?
Well, as I mentioned, CDC has a long history. It has been around for 70 years. And over the course of that time, it's done many things. My right honourable friend, a former Secretary of State, got CDC to change how it was focusing its investments. So it is actually focused now on the poorest countries and Africa in particular, and that's actually where the heavy lifting is still to be done. So it still has some legacy investments from places like Latin America and so forth, but it is primarily concerned now in Africa. And I think we need to dispel some of the myths about investing in these countries. We get good returns for that, very competitive returns, and I would urge financial institutions and investors to look at the opportunities that there are in Africa and Asia.
Leo Doherty.
Mr. Speaker, I commend the Secretary of State on her speech today. Can she confirm that she believes, like me, that it is right and proper for our aid budget to support our national interest?
Secretary of State.
I set a new higher spending bar for the department because, as well as spending money well, we should ensure, we have a duty to ensure that it could not be spent better. And that means that we're doing the right thing within the development world, that we're doing the best we can with that budget towards improving health and education. But we also need to look across to our domestic priorities as well. And I think that if we can be as explicit as we can about the benefits to the British public for what we're doing in aid, for example, research that we have done has led to new treatments which are being used today on our NHS wards, that the public would be pleased with that.
And Mary Cray.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The global goals seek to end poverty, violence and hunger in all its forms in this country as well as overseas, but the 0.7% of gross national income on development assistance should be a floor, not a ceiling. So while I have some sympathies with the accounting issues that she's dealing with in terms of the reinvestment of any profits that are made, can I seek a guarantee from her that any investments, either through the World Bank or the Asia Infrastructure Bank, that we are making through that budget are climate neutral and environmentally friendly? And can I tell her there's not a single pension trustee in this country that will invest overseas if they think that their investment is going to displace government investment?
Secretary of State.
Well, I thank the Right Honourable Lady for her understanding of the issue around how we account for ODA, and I will reassure her that this is a government that has introduced the 0.7%. I've been an aid worker. I do believe in aid spending. I think if we don't spend money on development, we pile costs onto other areas of public spending, such as defence. But I would reassure her that the speech I've made today, and I'd urge her to read it if she's not, sets out that we want to do more. We have to do more. Otherwise, we're not going to deliver the global goals. So I can give her that guarantee. And she's absolutely right. I think that the public want to know where their investments are going. They want to know the environmental issues. They want to know the social issues.
Rebecca Powell.
Very much, Mr. Speaker. Does my right honourable friend agree that this is about using the aid budget to encourage investment from new sources and including helping the British public invest in companies that will invest in the global goals? And does she agree with me that in the light of the serious and desperately troubling climate change and global warming issues raised this week, that this is more serious than ever that we adopt this funding model? Otherwise, we will never address the carbon issues that we face.
Well, the Honourable Lady is absolutely right. I think it's only 1 in 5 high net worth individuals invest in ethical businesses and businesses that are going to help towards delivering the global goals. We've got to do more if we're going to, and we want to explore how we can help that happen.
Now, Lloyd Russell Moyle.
This morning I searched in vain for any content of her leadership bid, her speech that she gave, and the only content that I found was that she's going to start a national conversation. Her party has only just successfully lobbied the OECD to change the rules to allow the billions invested into CDC to be counted as aid up front, and now she says she wants another change. So can I ask for clarity? If £1 has been invested by this government in CDC and it recirculates 2 or 3 times, does she count that once as £1 from the Treasury, or does she count it 3, 4, 5, 6 times and pat herself on the back whilst reducing the 0.7? Will she commit to the 0.7 being a floor, not a cap?
Well, I would again reiterate that it's this government that has introduced 0.7. I think that well, we have introduced it and we've kept it. And the thrust of my speech today, I'm quite sure that honourable members opposite have not read it. But if they had read it, they would know that this is about levering more in. And I would say to honourable members, what we are trying to do in international development is not about some doctrine of the purity of aid or what we should do with public money. It's about changing people's lives and it's about saving lives. And this is about us being able to actually deliver what we need to do that. Currently, we have chosen, because we're capitalising those investment vehicles, to do ODA one way. We argued for that, and we have agreement to do that. What I'm saying is that in future years, if we want to do more of this, if we want to make our aid budget more sustainable, then we should look and explore these options now. And we should do it in consultation with the people whose money it is we're spending, the British taxpayer. And we should do it with consultation with those organisations that are investing their savings and their pensions. Otherwise, folks, we are not going to deliver the global goals. And this is what we are here to do.
Mr. Philip Holloway.
Could I congratulate my right honourable friend on injecting a big cold dose of common sense and reality into how international aid might best be delivered. The poor, starving child in Africa who lives in a tin shack and whose parents don't have work doesn't really care whether it's the private sector or the public sector that delivers that aid. But if the involvement of the private sector means that that child is fed, his family housed and his parents employed, then bring it on.
I agree with my right honourable friend, and I stand ready to receive other advice from the benches opposite about how we might close the 2.5 trillion funding gap. The Shadow Home Secretary isn't allowed to help with the maths, but if we can deliver that through private investment, if we could deliver that, we can deliver the global goals. And we've got to stop this dogma in the aid sector that anything done by the private sector is a bad thing. It's the only way we can actually deliver the goals.
You Merriman.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I remain committed to the 0.7 figure, but I have no issue if that's made up of taxpayers' money and a rate of return from taxpayers' money, so long as the sum total is 0.7. But can I ask the Secretary of State for reassurance that decisions will not be made on what gives the greatest investment return, but the greatest humanitarian outcome?
Well, absolutely, and businesses are very interested in this agenda. They're interested in seeing how they can actually embed the global goals into their company reporting. There's a huge demand for that. There's a huge demand for advice and support to enable them to do that. And the possibilities are really incredible. And I think we should support our entrepreneurs and we should support those philanthropists that also want to donate, because they're another part of this issue as well, with the potential that impact investing has. And they want to do some good in this world, and we should support them to do that.
Weststreeting. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Well, the Prime Minister's cuddly, compassionate, Conservative pitch hasn't even lasted the first day back. Not only have we just had a totally unnecessary and gratuitous attack on the Shadow Home Secretary from the International Development Secretary, it's also clear from the briefing, isn't it, that what this speech was about this morning was a pitch to the right wing of the Conservative Party as part of leadership ambitions. And the pitch is simple. We're going to roll in the private sector and roll back the state. That's what she's announced today, isn't it?
I will circulate my speech to honourable members. Honourable members must understand that ODA, the 0.7, cannot be private funds. It can only be public funds, whether it be money that governments have put in or returns, potentially, from those funds in those publicly owned investment vehicles. I'm sorry, the honourable gentleman accuses me of playing to the gallery, as it were. I think the honourable members opposite are doing that. I haven't heard an honourable member opposite stand up and defend good British business that wants to use its resources to help alleviate and eradicate poverty. We're behind that agenda, and I would urge honourable members opposite to get with it too.
Mr. Kevin Foster.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As the Secretary of State will know, hundreds of millions of people around the world have been brought out of extreme poverty by global trade and investment, so it's bizarre to hear it attacked today. Would she agree with me that proper aid policies, teamed up with sustainable investment and good trade, is the very thing that will deliver a vision for the future for many third world countries, rather than a vision of Venezuela?
I agree with the honourable gentleman, and actually we've talked about sort of distant investors and pension funds. It's also British entrepreneurs. There's an entrepreneur who I had a meeting with this afternoon who is young gentleman setting up factories to produce clothing around the world. He's taking women who've been living on the streets, giving them a job, giving them healthcare, education, childcare. He's doing amazing things, and actually business can be a huge force for good. We now have tools to monitor what business is doing and what progress they're making, and I really think we ought to get behind them and let them help.
Thank you,
Mr. Speaker. I chair the Africa All-Party Parliamentary Group, which has been at the forefront of promoting greater good trade and investment links with Africa as being in all our interests. But that must complement, not replace, our aid commitment. In treating pensions investments as aid, she's sending a signal that our pensioners should be dependent on the returns on charitable donations, and that trade with Africa is a question of charity. And is she really saying that we will be monitoring these new funding investments through company reporting rather than making the investment fund managers accountable to this House?
No, I'm sorry. The Right Honourable Lady is confused between two things. There is the issue of private, separate funds completely from government, pension funds, other financial instruments, investing in Africa. And that's what we want them to do. There is a separate issue. Well, we don't do enough of it. We don't do enough of it. There's £8 trillion in the city which could be levered to that cause. So we don't do enough of it. She's confusing that with something else, which is public funds and publicly owned investment vehicles like CDC, like the Indian Infrastructure Fund, PIDGE, all those other investment vehicles, and their profits, which are wholly public funds being used potentially years hence to count towards our aid.
Rachel McLean.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Does my right honourable friend welcome the fact that as we leave the EU, we will be able to have additional control over the 1.5 billion that we currently channel through them within our international aid budget? And how does she think we can use that money to alleviate the global development goals?
Well, we have all sorts of choices ahead of us as we take back control of that money. I've outlined today that I think we should be doing more investments that are going to create the jobs and livelihoods that these nations need to lift themselves out of poverty and bring a return to the UK so we can make the work that we do more sustainable and, if we choose, increase it.
Perkins.
There is a legal duty under the International Development Act 2002 that aid spending must be spent on poverty reduction overseas. There is a responsibility on investors to maximise returns for their pension holders and shareholders. And these are probably contradictory priorities. So does the Secretary of State recognise that if she's talking about this investment in the terms of aid rather than in terms of investment, she's either going to have to change the International Development Act, or she's talking about something entirely different to what we understand currently as what aid spending is?
I will refer the honourable gentleman to the answer I gave a moment ago. These are two different things that I think many honourable members opposite are confusing. One reason why we're in the 0.7 club is that we don't mark our own homework. Someone else does. That should provide some reassurance to people that we're not doing something that we're saying we are. So there is a very different issue between what a private company entirely separate from government chooses to do, and what we're trying to encourage them to do is do some good in the world and to invest in these developing nations that need that investment and that will give them a great return on that investment. There's a separate issue about what we do with public funds, which count towards the ODA spend. We're not talking about using the private funds to replace that. What we're talking about in terms of the DAC rules is looking at how we count ODA and to ensure that when we get returns back, we have more flexibility as to what we do with that. We could spend more money on development, or we could retain our 0.7 commitment and spend up some of those returns on the National Health Service.
Grateful to the Secretary of State. I appreciate that it is sometimes convenient, not least within government departments, for ministers to use shorthand, but for the avoidance of doubt and for the benefit of those attending to our proceedings who are not within the curtilage of the chamber, I should point out that odour refers not to an unpleasant smell, but to overseas development assistance. Order. Statement the Secretary of State for exiting the European Union. Secretary Dominic Raab.
With permission, Mr. Speaker, I would like to update the House on the progress in negotiations to leave the EU and the government's planning for no deal. Since I last updated the House, our negotiations with the EU have continued and intensified. Over the recess break, we have been engaging constructively with our EU counterparts. Let me take the main areas of the negotiations in turn. On the withdrawal agreement, while there remain some differences, we are closing in on workable solutions to all of the key outstanding issues, building on the progress we made during the summer on issues such as data and information, the treatment of ongoing police and judicial cooperation in criminal matters, and ongoing union judicial and administrative procedures after the date of exit. We have also been discussing our proposals on the linkage needed between the withdrawal agreement and the future relationship, and the EU is engaging constructively. EU leaders at the informal Salzburg summit. We understand the EU raised some concerns, particularly around the distinction between goods and services under the Common Rulebook and with respect to the facilitated customs arrangement. We continue to engage constructively with the EU. We continue to press our case. The UK's white paper proposals are the best way of ensuring there is continued frictionless trade in goods after Britain leaves the EU, whilst fulfilling the joint commitment to avoid a hard border between Northern Ireland and Ireland and respecting the referendum. These negotiations, Mr. Speaker, were always bound to be tough in the final stretch. That's all the more reason why we should hold our nerve, stay resolute and focused, and I remain confident we will reach a deal this autumn, because it is still in the best interests of the UK and the European Union. It is the best way of protecting trade between Britain and the EU, trade which underpins jobs across the continent. It's the best way of making sure we continue to cooperate seamlessly on security matters, to tackle crime and terrorism, to keep UK and European citizens safe. And it's the best way to avoid a hard border in Northern Ireland that would adversely affect communities living there, or indeed separating Northern Ireland from Great Britain, which we will not countenance. To achieve these aims, the UK has brought forward serious and credible proposals. We continue to engage with the EU to press our case and to better understand the nature of some of their concerns. Equally, it is time for the EU to match the ambition and the pragmatism that we have shown. Mr. Speaker, while we intensify our negotiations to secure the deal that we want, the deal that we expect, we are also expediting the preparations for no deal, in case the EU do not match the ambition and the pragmatism that we have shown. As the Prime Minister stated on the 21st of September, after the Salzburg summit, the government has made clear we will unilaterally protect the rights of EU citizens in the UK in the event of no deal. To the 3 million here, we say, you are our friends, you are our neighbours, our colleagues, we want you to stay, and we will be setting out the details as soon as is practicable. We also now urge the EU and all its member states to step up and give the UK citizens on the continent the same reassurances. Mr. Speaker, it is time on both sides to provide all our citizens with that comfort and with that confidence. Since I last updated the House in September, we have published 52 more technical notices in 2 further batches. They inform people, businesses and other key stakeholders of the steps they need to take if we don't reach a deal with the EU. They cover a wide range of sectors, building on other work that's taken place across government over the last 2 years. They cover and they enable us to prepare the UK for Brexit irrespective of the outcome of the negotiations. They acknowledge that there are risks to a no-deal scenario, but they also demonstrate the steps we will take to avoid, mitigate and manage any potential short-term risk and disruption. Overall now, we've published 77 technical notices, which form part of the sensible, proportionate measures that we are taking to prepare the country for every eventuality. Mr. Speaker, our most recent batch of technical notices were published on the 24th of September. They're set out in a written ministerial statement today. And there are 24 which range from aviation and the advice for airlines on the impact of no deal and the actions for them to consider to maintain services on the day we leave the EU, through to car insurance and the arrangements to ensure green cards will be available free of charge from insurance companies to enable UK drivers to continue to drive on the continent. The publication of the technical notices enables further engagement as part of our no-deal planning. So, for example, our earlier technical notice on VAT set out the VAT changes that companies will need to prepare when importing or exporting goods from the EU, when supplying services to the EU or interacting with EU VAT IT systems. That one was welcomed by the British Chamber of Commerce, and we are grateful to them, and indeed we're grateful to all of our stakeholders for their constructive, ongoing engagement on that necessary planning. More broadly, Mr. Speaker, I've met with the British Chamber of Commerce, the CBI, the Institute of Directors, the EEF and the Federation of Small Businesses as part of the government's Business Advisory Group on the 17th of September to make sure we're explaining our negotiating proposals and no-deal planning and listening to UK businesses of all size and across all sectors. We will keep providing people and businesses with the advice they need as we negotiate our exit from the European Union. We also keep working with the devolved administrations on all aspects of our planning for exit. I attended the Joint Ministerial Committee on the 13th of September. It has now met 12 times, and our last meeting was a valuable opportunity to give the devolved administrations a full update on the negotiations, as well as discuss the necessary no-deal planning. We continue to listen very carefully to all of their views. Mr. Speaker, that is the way, with a concerted effort on all fronts, that we have put ourselves in the best position to make the very best of Brexit, and I commend the statement to the House.
Sir Keir Starmer.
Mr. Speaker, can I thank the Secretary of State for advance sight of his statement, and it's always good to see him in his place. But can I politely point out that it would have been much better if this statement had come from the Prime Minister? It's no good hiding behind the badging. It's no good hiding behind the badging of the Salzburg summit as informal. It was the Prime Minister who pushed for Brexit to be on the agenda at Salzburg. It was the Prime Minister who was there to lead the negotiations, and it was the Prime Minister who failed to secure a breakthrough. So it should be the Prime Minister, not the Secretary of State in Parliament this afternoon, explaining what went wrong. Mr. Speaker, after all, whilst the Prime Minister was negotiating in Salzburg, the Secretary of State was busy writing gimmicky letters to me about Labour policy. And it would have... I have to say, the image of the Secretary of State writing gimmicky letters to me on the very day of the Salzburg negotiations speaks absolutely for itself. Mr. Speaker, it would also have been better if today's statement contained details of substantive progress. Instead, it's like Groundhog Day. We get the same old story. The Secretary of State pretends everything's going according to plan. It's just a question of dotting the I's and crossing the T's. Everything will be all right in the end. And if it isn't, we just crush out with no deal, stockpile food and medicines, and declare that to be a great success. I know the Brexit Secretary will be tempted in reply to me to do what he usually does, to read out his pre-prepared attack lines about me and the Labour Party. Can I urge him? Can I urge him? Can I urge him? Can I urge him to resist that temptation and to respond to the very serious questions that this House and the country deserve answers to? Firstly, Mr. Speaker, this Secretary of State repeatedly assured Parliament, including from that dispatch box himself, that a deal would be reached by the October Council. His words. Well, that's next week. The statement contains no such statement today. So can he firstly update the House on when he now expects a deal to be put before Parliament? Secondly, it's all very well the Secretary of State saying that we're closing in on workable solutions and listing the areas of agreement reached months ago. But we've been here before, many times, and that overlooks the fact that the remaining bit is the hard bit of agreeing the backstop in Northern Ireland. Exactly. A solemn commitment was made to a legally binding backstop in Northern Ireland in all circumstances last December. 10 months later, and all we're hearing is that the government will publish updated proposals on the backstop at some unspecified date. Well, with 9 days to go, when will that be? There is no answer in today's statement, and we need an answer. And can the Secretary of State take the opportunity now to scotch rumours that the government is not even intending to publish a backstop proposal by next week? I'm being repeatedly asked what I would do. I'd happily... Mr. Speaker, I would happily swap sides. I would happily swap sides at any stage. And there'd be a lot more progress in the negotiations. Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker. Move out.
I've had reason to say to you before, Mr. Spencer, I'm quite worried about you. I always regarded you as a rather laid-back, gentlemanly farmer. You seem to have mutated into something altogether more vociferous and aggressive. I can't believe it's what you're eating. Calm yourself, man. Sir Keir Starmer.
Mr. Speaker, it's being reported on the backstop that the government are now willing to accept an indefinite UK-wide customs union as part of the Northern Ireland backstop offer. Of course, it won't actually be using the words customs union.
Call it what you like.
So can the Secretary of State set the record straight? Is a customs union now the government policy, at least for the Northern Ireland backstop? Yes or no?
Yeah.
Thirdly, Mr Speaker, the Secretary of State repeatedly told Parliament that the final deal this House votes on would include a clear blueprint for the future relationship with the EU. In recent days, the government's been emphasising just how precise this will be. Yet it's nowhere to be seen. The Chequers proposals have been widely rejected by the EU and by MPs across this House. And there's growing concern now that the government is heading for no deal, as recent warnings from businesses including Toyota and BMW underline. Absolutely. And if it's not no deal, then a vague deal, asking us to jump blindfold into the unknown. Well, Labour will not support that. So can the Secretary of State take this opportunity to rule out a vague or blind Brexit? Mr Speaker, for all the warm words, the reality is this. The government's had 18 months, yet they've not even included the terms of the withdrawal agreement, and they've barely started negotiating the details of the future relationship with the EU. A responsible government would realise the fix that it's in. Instead, this government simply repeats the mantra, it's Chequers or no deal. It's not so much nothing has changed as nothing can change. This is not a necessity, this is a political choice, and it's deeply irresponsible. No government has the right to plunge the country into chaos as a result of its own failure. Time is running out, but there's still time to change course, and I urge the Secretary of State to do so. Thank you.
Well, can I thank the Shadow Brexit Secretary for his opening remarks, at least. He asked a number of questions. First of all, the Prime Minister would not normally update the House on an informal summit, and that was not the practice under the previous Labour governments, as he probably well knows. He asked me about the October Council. We've always been clear we would aim for the October Council, but there would be leeway that it might slip into November, and I think we're still clear on that. The October Council next week, of course, will be an important milestone. We expect that to be a moment where we will make some progress, and of course, as I've said already in my remarks, we need the EU to match the ambition and the pragmatism that we've showed. He asked about whether we were signing up to an indefinite customs union for Northern Ireland. No, categorically, that is not correct. Well, I set out very clearly in my statement, if you were paying attention. He also talked about investment into this country. I was surprised that he didn't therefore welcome the recent decision by Rolls-Royce to increase its investment in the UK, or the decision by Unilever to maintain its dual UK-Dutch structure. He referred to my letter asking him for some of the most basic questions on Labour's policy on the substance. He's almost become the prince of process, arguing about protocol and procedure, but can't argue a single question on the substance. In reality, we got some of the answers at the Labour Party conference, because we had the Shadow Brexit Secretary say that Labour would whip a vote against any deal outside the customs union that the United Kingdom strikes with 27 other EU member states. So let's just be clear on this. If all 28 governments agree on a deal that works for the UK, that works for the EU, the Labour front bench, at least, would vote against it, would try and veto it. Worse still, we've got the leader of the Labour Party, I'm glad that he's here to answer for this, who has opened the door to a second referendum, a thinly veiled ruse to reverse Brexit altogether. It is now clear, Mr. Speaker, to every voter that the Labour leadership have trashed their promise at the last election to deliver on Brexit. They've allowed political opportunism to consume what's in the national interest, and they've demonstrated yet again that they are just not fit to govern.
Mr. Kenneth Clark.
Mr. Speaker, our opening position from the Chequers meeting is that our offer is that we will join part of the single market, so long as we don't comply with all the rules as they are at the moment of the single market, and we'll join the customs union so long as we're allowed to have an exception allowing us to put holes through the tariff wall with our own third-party agreements with other countries. And the other EU leaders have been signalling for months that that is unacceptable, and that's not so far got us very far. As our chief negotiator, will the Minister assure me that he now expects that in all international organisations, the EU will indeed move a little nearer to our position, just as we move a little nearer to theirs as a matter of compromise? And will he reject as quite ridiculous the arguments are coming from some quarters that we resolve this serious international dispute by tearing up Chequers and moving even further away from the EU's minimum requirements of anybody to have an open trading relationship with the continent?
Well, I should thank my right honourable friend. Our proposals deliberately deliver not just on the referendum, but on the manifesto commitment that we all stood at the last election, which was to exit the customs union, but secure the best possible trading relationship, preserve the integrity of the whole of the United Kingdom. And as you've said, as the right honourable gentleman has said, we have set out clearly the ambition and the pragmatism of our proposals, and it is quite right now to expect the EU to move in our direction. And if they do match that ambition, if they do match that pragmatism, I'm confident that we can still reach a deal.
No answer. Mr. Peter Grant.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm grateful to the Secretary of State for advance sight of the statement, both the advance copy of today's statement that I got a few hours ago and the statement he gave us on the 4th of September, which was basically an advance statement, an advance copy of today's statement, because very little seemed to have changed since then. It's been nice to spend some time again listening to ministers from a united, competent government who very much of the citizens of the nation
You should try it.
and to listen to political debate, political disagreements being heard and debated in a respectful and consensual manner. But then I had to leave early for the SNP conference and come down here, and everything has changed. Mr. Speaker, we still do not know what the government intends to propose to the European Union or Northern Ireland. We know a litany of what they're not going to do that has to be thrown over every time to keep the DUP on side. We do not know what is being proposed on Northern Ireland. We're running out of time, Mr. Speaker. We need answers very, very quickly indeed. There's a brief update on the EU's response to the trade package in Chequers proposal. They didn't raise some concerns about it. They said it will not be acceptable to their member states. It's not going to happen. Chequers has been bounced. Take it off the table and try again. And can I gently correct the Secretary of State that the single, simplest and easiest way to achieve everything that the government says they want to achieve through Brexit is to stay in the customs union. We welcome the progress that's been made and the commitments that have been made on citizens' rights, but the rights of these citizens would never have been under threat had it not been for the unilateral decision to come out of the single market. If they're that worried about the rights of future generations of citizens, stay in the single market. Why can't we do that, Mr. Speaker? Because of an unnecessary, dogmatic, unilateral decision that was taken by the Prime Minister almost before the negotiations had even started. From day one, the approach has been dictated by hardliners who, if they're lucky, constitute 1 in 5 of the Parliamentary Conservative Party, who couldn't manage 1 in 10 of the membership of the present House of Commons. Those who would quite happily go for a hard no-deal Brexit, although they say it's not what they want, those who are serried to the far right of the Secretary of State right now, appropriately enough. The entire dogmatic approach is being driven still by a tiny minority of this House. We could almost say that the tail is being allowed to wag the dogma. Can the Secretary of State tell us what assessment have the government made of the cost to every business in the UK of complying with the avalanche of technical advice they're now being expected to follow? Has any assessment been made at all? And if so, are we going to be allowed to see it this time? Will he confirm that whatever some who prop up his government might tell him, peace in Northern Ireland is not expendable, it is sacrosanct, and it is not negotiable under any circumstances whatsoever? Will the government reject once and for all the demands of the hardline majority? Will they accept that it is now time to listen pragmatically and constructively
to the compromises that have been offered almost 2 years ago by the Scottish Government, to the compromises that are being offered by others in this House just now? Will he agree to talk to those who might have an answer before we all crash off the cliff edge together?
Secretary of State.
Can I thank the honourable gentleman for his call for sensible and respectful debate, and I can also agree with him that every effort needs to be made to preserve our precious union. And one thing which I think is very clear in this House, notwithstanding all the differences we have, is that we will not allow any proposals from the EU to draw a customs line down the Irish Sea. The honourable gentleman asked about Northern Ireland and our proposals. Of course, our white paper proposals through the economic partnership will provide the long-term sustainable answer to this question, as well as preserving frictionless trade with our EU partners. They will, in the process, resolve the concerns around the Northern Irish border. At the same time, we remain committed to the joint report in December, which would be for a limited, finite and temporary backstop. He also asked about economic analysis, and that will be made available at the time, in time for the meaningful vote. And then finally, he asked about staying in the single market and the customs union. The reality is, as the honourable gentleman well knows, if you stay members of the single market and the customs union, you're not really leaving the EU.
Mr. Ian Duncan-Smith.
Mr. Speaker, can I just say to my honourable friend, I'm astonished that he's written to his opposite number attacking Labour policy. Nobody here knows what Labour policy really is. So perhaps he could share those letters with us so we can understand even better. Can I ask my right honourable friend whether or not he read the recent paper by two ex-Northern Ireland secretaries, Lord Trimble and his predecessor, explaining how practical solutions were available right now to resolve any issues around having a hard border in Northern Ireland? If he read it, does he agree, therefore, that paper demonstrates there is now no need for a backstop proposal?
Well, can I thank my right honourable friend for his questions? The search for a Labour Party policy on the EU and on Brexit continues. Reports, and there have been various reports out on the technical solution to Northern Ireland. They've provided very important, useful additional insights. The reality is we have committed, on top of the technical solutions, to agree a legally binding backstop with the EU, but it will have to be temporary and it will have to meet the conditions that we set out and which the Prime Minister repeated in the aftermath in her statement after the Salzburg summit.
Hilary Benn.
Thank you very much indeed, Mr. Speaker. Can I say to the Secretary of State that the more no-deal technical notices he's published during the summer, the more he has confirmed as correct the judgment of the Select Committee that a no-deal Brexit would be chaotic and damaging. My question, however, relates to the outstanding issue in the negotiations, namely agreeing a legally operable and sound backstop to keep an open border in Northern Ireland. Given that the backstop, if it is used, will have to last until such time as another agreement is reached that achieves the same outcome, can he please explain to the House how on earth a backstop could be limited by an artificial time limit?
Well, I thank the right honourable gentleman. The point about the backstop is we hope it will never be used. If it is required, it should be for a temporary, limited period. And he says that he asked the question, how can that be guaranteed? In fact, I think on the EU side, there are limits to the extent to which they can rely on Article 50 for the backstop. There are very real legal concerns on the EU side. But of course, we expect there's no deal until you've got the whole deal, and that includes not just the withdrawal agreement and the protocol in Northern Ireland, but clear steps and a clear pathway to the future relationship, which will provide the lasting, sustainable answer on the Northern Ireland issue by making sure we have frictionless trade.
Sir William Cash.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Given the vote to leave and the promised future control over our laws in this Parliament, why are UK voters and businesses being confronted with binding EU rules on goods indefinitely made behind closed doors by 27 other member states with no effective parliamentary lock? Or will he explain now how that parliamentary lock which is being put about would actually work in practice rather than theory?
Well, I thank my honourable friend, and I don't accept that characterisation of the white paper proposals. There would be not just technical consultation, but consultation on any legislative proposal in advance. But he is right to say that we would be taking an upfront decision to agree to sign up to the Common Rule Book on industrial goods and agri-food in order to maintain frictionless trade, and there would be a parliamentary lock, but we would have to be mindful, as the white paper sets out, of the consequences of exercising that lock.
Yvette Cooper.
The Minister rightly ruled out a hard border in Northern Ireland and also a customs border in the Irish Sea. But isn't it time now to be honest with people about what that means? He appeared to be ruling out a customs union in the backstop. Is he also ruling out a common external tariff in the Irish backstop? Yes or no?
Well, I thank the Right Honourable Lady. We've been very clear about this in relation to it needs to be time limited. We would not accept an arrangement which drew a customs border down the Irish Sea, and it needs to be limited so that we can bridge to the future relationship, which would give us all the advantages of free trade, which we want to take advantage of, both in terms of export opportunities from Latin America to Asia, but also to reduce the cost of living here at home.
Mr. John Redwood.
Will he confirm that if we just leave without signing a penal and one-sided withdrawal agreement, we will have £39 billion to spend on our priorities, which would be a huge boost to our economy and our public services, a true Brexit bonus? How can an agreement be better than that?
Well, I thank my right honourable friend. He's certainly right to point to the countervailing opportunities that a no-deal scenario would have, but I think it is also only the responsible thing to do, as we have in our 77 technical notices and our wider planning, to be very clear that the no-deal outcome is suboptimal, because there are risks and there are short-term disruptions and a buffeting to the UK economy and all those other things. I'm confident we could get through it, but I think it's by far in the way the superior outcome to get a good deal with the EU, which is good for the UK, good for the EU, preserves our trade with them, preserves our security cooperation, and at the same time liberates us to trade more energetically with the growth markets of the world.
Mr. Ben Bradshaw.
Mr. Speaker, if the Tories want to know what Labour policy is, they should read the excellent motion that was passed recently at our party conference. But can I ask him, does he agree that any withdrawal agreement must include precise guarantees that Britain and the EU will enjoy frictionless trade in the event of Brexit, as the number 10 Downing Street spokesman said yesterday?
The honourable gentleman will know that our proposal set out very clearly in the white paper. That's what we're pursuing. He's right to say that the negotiations have been tough, but you don't throw your hands up in despair, you knuckle down, you hold your nerve, and we'll keep pursuing and pressing our case. What I cannot do is accept the case he makes for reversing the referendum. That will be a democratic outrage, and is not something that we will countenance.
Amber Rudd.
Mr. Speaker, can I welcome the deliberative approach to Brexit that protects businesses and endeavours to make sure that that frictionless travel will continue across the border. But can I ask the Secretary of State what his plans are in the event of a no deal for security matters? I remain very concerned about the somewhat gung-ho approach to no deal, given that the security matters are not yet in place to ensure that our country remains safe from terrorists, safe from organised crime, and the EU has the same benefits from our efforts.
Well, can I thank my right honourable friend for her remarks? I'm confident that in the medium to long term, we would of course resume all of the kinds of cooperation that one would expect. But it's right to say that in a no-deal scenario, we could not rely on the EU just continuing that in the short term. One thing that can be said, though, in that scenario, there would be countervailing opportunities. For example, in relation, she talks about security, preventative checks at the border, and the ability to deport when you're beyond the free movement rules that we're bound by under the EU.
Luciana Berger.
Thank you. The Secretary of State said in response to my honourable friend from Exeter that he didn't quite respond, and I think it's a very important point. Yesterday, we heard from a number 10 spokesman that there must be precise guarantees that Britain and the EU will enjoy frictionless trade after Brexit. Will the Secretary of State now confirm that these guarantees will be a condition in the withdrawal agreement?
I'm grateful to the Honourable Lady. I'm not sure I'm going to allow or let the opposition benches set conditions on the UK's policy when it's been clearly set out in our white paper. We want to pursue the frictionless trade with the EU that we have right now, and that's what our proposal will deliver. But of course, it requires the EU to meet us halfway, to match the ambition and the pragmatism that we've shown.
Mr. Owen Patterson.
Mr. Speaker, if the backstop comes into operation, the UK will effectively be within the rules of the single market and the customs union and ultimately the ECJ. 3 times the Secretary of State has said this arrangement will be temporary, but it will be open-ended. What will be the exact legal process by which we will end this, and what will be the incentives for the EU to end this arrangement when they are happily taking large sums of public money from the British taxpayer?
Well, thank my right honourable friend. We've made clear that it will be temporary and finite. I think the reassurance I can give him in advance of the publication of our proposals will be that for the EU it's very difficult. From their perspective, there's a difference in the way the customs union is described, because for them it would normally include free movement and the rules on free movement, which in the case of the backstop wouldn't apply. So there will be a lot of pressure on the EU, both legally and as a matter of policy, to end the backstop, and we will not agree to anything which does not have a clear process and steps to exit. And I'm afraid the Honourable Lady doesn't.
Mr. Nigel Dodds.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The idea that the sort of proposals that are floating about from the EU side, and indeed some officials on our side in Brussels, are necessary to prevent a hard border on the island of Ireland is, of course, complete rubbish. There already is infrastructure on the border, and there already are financial, fiscal and other differences because it's an international border. Of course it can be managed. But can I draw the Secretary of State's attention to what the Prime Minister said in her commitments to Northern Ireland on the 6th of December, which she said no new borders within the United Kingdom. The whole of the UK, including Northern Ireland, will leave the customs union and the single market. And on the 17th of December, she agreed that nothing would be done to create any border, constitutional, political, economic or regulatory, between Northern Ireland and the rest of the United Kingdom. Does he stand by that? Because he needs to understand that as far as we are concerned, as a Democratic Unionist Party, we will not tolerate anything that separates Northern Ireland from the rest of the United Kingdom in terms of customs or single market as we leave the European Union. We've been clear about that from day one. It's why we had the debacle in December. Let's not repeat that mistake.
Well, listen carefully to the honourable gentleman. He registered his position very clearly. We intend, as he knows, because we've been engaging on this issue, we intend to honour all the commitments we've made back in December, and we will not do anything which would be a threat to the economic or constitutional integrity of the United Kingdom.
Oh, I'm sorry to see the honourable gentleman looking mildly anguished. We must hear... No? Well, I'm very heartened to hear it. We must hear from the voice of Harwich and North Essex. Sir Bernard Jenkin.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I commend my right honourable friend in the government for being absolutely determined to avoid any new infrastructure at the Northern Ireland border? And can he explain what the policy of the government would be if we leave the European Union with no deal, and therefore there is no backstop, and we have a customs frontier? Will the government implement the technical measures to maintain an invisible customs frontier, and will he rule out any new infrastructure at the border between the north and the south?
Can I thank my honourable friend? We've been clear we will see no return to the hard border under any circumstances, and that's been made clear not just to all parties in Northern Ireland but also to the Commission in Brussels.
Liz Kendall.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Let me try this again, because the Brexit Secretary is trying to shimmy his way out of this. Yesterday, the Prime Minister's spokesman said, and I quote, "There can be no withdrawal agreement without a precise future framework on trade." True? Yes or no?
True.
Sir Desmond Swain.
Any decision to exit a backstop agreement must be one for Her Majesty's government, mustn't it?
My honourable friend is absolutely right that we could not allow any third party, or in this case the EU, to have a lock on the process, and that it could not last indefinitely.
Mr. Christopher Leslie.
Commend the Minister for his frank answer to my honourable friend for Leicester West, because it sounded as though he was finally ruling out the notion of a blindfolded Brexit, this question that somehow in the withdrawal treaty there wouldn't be precise guarantees for frictionless trade for the future relationship. So will he make sure that when he brings that motion before the House, if that is exactly what is presented, we will have full details about all of that trade relationship for the future?
Well, first of all, there's no question of some kind of blindfolded Brexit. We're going to be agreeing a withdrawal agreement and the Northern Ireland Protocol, and we want to make sure in the political declaration on the future relationship that we have enough detail, enough of the substance, so that this House and the country at large understand the choice of the model of economic and security cooperation that we're going to be pursuing.
Mr. Damien Green.
Mr. Speaker, my right honourable friend has rightly paid much attention to the Northern Ireland border. Can I draw his attention to other important borders, notably the cross-channel border and all the trade that comes through Dover and through the roads of Kent every day? Can he assure me that the deal he's looking for will ensure frictionless trade through the port of Dover, so that we avoid any kind of local chaos on the roads in Kent and more wider economic chaos in the supply chains of manufacturing industry throughout this country? This is a very, very important part of the negotiations.
Can I thank my right honourable friend? He's absolutely right that our proposals are designed, as well as the issue of Northern Ireland, to guarantee frictionless trade, and in particular for those manufacturing businesses that rely on those supply chains. And it's a critical element of the white paper proposals, and that's why we're pressing it so hard.
Mr. Stephen Kinnock.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Secretary of State has said that the backstop has to be time limited. Could he just share with the House which particular date he has in mind and how he came to settle on that date?
We're not in a position yet to give a date, but all that can be. But we'll publish that when we publish the proposals in the round. But what can't be allowed to happen is to allow either Northern Ireland or the UK as a whole to linger in an indefinite limbo of the customs union.
Mr. Stephen Crabb.
The intransigence shown by the EU at Salzburg and some of the other antics there would have reminded every Leave voter in the country, and a great many others, that leaving the EU is the right thing to do. But how confident is my right honourable friend that we will see that outbreak of spirit of pragmatism that he spoke earlier in order to land that deal later this autumn?
Well, I thank my right honourable friend. I think he's right in his summary of the Salzburg summit, but I think the thing to do in a negotiation like this is to keep your cool, hold your nerve, and keep doing the professional statesman-like thing, which is exactly what our Prime Minister has done. In terms of confidence of reaching a deal, we can't control the other side, but I think the prognosis is good, because it is in the EU's interest, just as much as the UK's interest, to get a strong deal on everything from trade to security cooperation, to secure the livelihoods and the jobs on both sides, and in particular to keep UK and EU citizens safe.
Vera Hobhouse.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. At the heart of the Brexit promise was that we can gain full control, free ourselves from EU institutions and regulations while maintaining the same economic prosperity we have enjoyed during 40 years of membership. Isn't it time, Mr. Speaker, that we come clean, that both simultaneously are not possible? There is a choice. We can choose Brexit or we can choose prosperity.
No, I don't accept that sort of binary choice. The one thing we must all do in this House as Democrats is respect the result of the referendum, but what we're seeking to achieve and secure is the win-win of retaining our strong trading and security links and cooperation with our EU partners, but be free not just to take back control of our own laws, but also to trade more liberally with the growth markets of the future, as I said, from Latin America to Asia.
Steve Baker.
Speaker, time and again, customs experts from a range of countries in the EU, including
Holland and Ireland tell us that a free trade agreement can be made to work across the Irish border using pragmatic arrangements. When will the government take this key that has been handed to them, keeping us in the prison of this negotiation, and admit that we can leave into an FTA basis which will make this a proper independent country, able to control its domestic regulations as well as its tariffs, so that we can lead the world into a new era of free trade?
Well, I respect my honourable friend, and I, again, as ever, pay tribute to the work he's done. But he will know, because he was in government, indeed in Dexter at the time, that whilst it may be theoretically possible for us to do that, we cannot do it and have a deal with the EU. The EU are not offering us Canada, Super Canada, an FTA, without keeping to the commitment that we made when he was in government in December to come up with a legally binding backstop. So that is a shortcut to no deal, and we've always said that we'd be ready if that outcome is forced on us, but the optimum aim here, the optimum objective that we're working towards, is a good deal with the EU. We couldn't get that if we pursued what he's suggesting.
Speaker, is the Minister aware that I consider myself sent here to secure the health, welfare and future prosperity of my constituents and the people of our country? Is he aware that anything he's said today does not convince me that we're heading for a steep decline and a miserable future for our country and for my constituents?
Well, all I'd say to him is that we are ambitious for our post-Brexit relationship with the EU. The economic news from the Bank of England on GDP accelerating in growth terms, but also rising real wages is important. I think this is the moment to go into these negotiations with some economic self-confidence and some political ambition. And if we do that, this country's best days lie ahead.
Mr. Speaker, the Japanese Prime Minister has recently declared that Japan would welcome the United Kingdom into the Trans-Pacific Partnership with open arms. Does my right honourable friend agree that membership of the TPP is highly attractive and should be pursued? But does he also agree that membership of it is virtually impossible for so long as we remain part of the customs union?
My honourable friend makes a very important point. He's also making a point. We want to pursue trade deals, whether it's with the US, whether it's with the Asia-Pacific countries, precisely because it is better than purely leaving on no deal in WTO terms. But I certainly accept the premise and the assumptions underlying his question, which is that we should not allow ourselves to remain in the customs union, because we would then avoid all of those opportunities of Brexit which we need to grasp.
Alison McGovern.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My constituents are worried about the political declaration to come from the Secretary of State, because so far all they have heard is warm words and political rhetoric, which doesn't, Mr. Speaker, guarantee their jobs. So can I ask the Secretary of State a simple question? Define frictionless.
Well, can I just say to the Honourable Lady, and I've listened to her in this debate, and she always makes sensible and constructive arguments, but we haven't just given warm words. We've set out in our white paper, 100 pages long, detailed proposals on the frictionless trade that she refers to, on security cooperation, and if she wants to give some reassurance to her constituents, I think she can point to that.
Dr. Sarah Wollaston.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Secretary of State will have heard the clear intention of many colleagues on these benches to vote down the Prime Minister's pragmatic deal. And meanwhile, the clock ticks down to the 29th of March, and there's a very serious risk that we could crash out with no deal and no transition. The consequences of that would be disastrous and very different from the dodgy prospectus that was set out at the referendum. And particularly if that is the case, will the Secretary of State commit to giving the British people the opportunity to give their informed consent to that final deal? It's not about obstructing the referendum, it's checking that we have informed consent, and no decent surgeon would proceed without it.
Well, I certainly agree with my honourable friend about the need to pursue a good deal with the EU, and all our efforts are focused on achieving that. I don't accept the premise of her suggestion on a second referendum. I think it would inevitably be aimed at trying to reverse Brexit, and I think that would create democratic outrage and huge amount of mistrust in the establishment of the political system.
Jonathan Edwards.
Mr. Speaker. He mentioned the GMC in his statement. An issue of huge importance to Wales is the issue of post-Brexit cohesion funding. And following Salzburg, the Prime Minister seemed to indicate that the proposed Shared Prosperity Fund would be the sole responsibility of the British government. As he knows, economic development is a devolved issue, but this seems to indicate that this matter would be clawed back by Westminster. Yeah. Isn't it now clear that for Wales, Brexit means the complete opposite of taking back control?
I thank the honourable gentleman for his question. Very important to make sure that Brexit works for all parts of the United Kingdom. On all of those devolution issues, we continue to engage with all the devolved administrations, including in Scotland. That's what I set out in my statement in relation to Scottish Welsh ministers and the officials from the Northern Ireland Secretariat. And we want to make sure in the process that he's described that we continue to engage and make sure that it's a great opportunity for the people of Scotland.
Mr. Peter Bone.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I would like to thank the excellent Secretary of State for coming to the House to make this statement. And obviously he would like to get a chequered deal. But as that has already been rejected by the European Union, and I have to say in some ways insulting the Prime Minister in the process, and that he thinks coming out without a deal is suboptimal, shouldn't we learn from a former great Labour Prime Minister about a third way? And surely checkers... Oh, they didn't cheer that point. I don't know why. Checkers plus. Is that not, if checkers fails, the way forward?
My honourable friend knows that we've made clear that we will listen to the other side, but we need to understand their objections. We're not going to just take the face value, a computer says no approach, when we've put a huge amount of effort and looked in a very innovative way at our proposals. So we'll continue to press our case to make sure we get a good deal, but